Welcome to Criticaleye's new podcast series, High Impact Leadership. My name is Marc Barber, Director of Content at Criticaleye, and I'll be taking you through this new series that we're launching. In each episode, we'll be talking through the ever-changing leadership landscape, exploring how senior executives and boards are tackling challenges around climate change, digitization, skills and talent, supply chain disruption and funding. Given all these headwinds, we'll be asking what it means to make an impact as a leader in today's environment. For our first episode, we have Matthew Blagg, CEO of Criticaleye, to talk through his thoughts on high impact leadership. Hi there, Matthew.
Morning, Mark. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Lots going on in the Criticaleye firmament at the moment, but yeah, very well. So yes, we're going to talk through high impact leadership, and I guess the opening question has to be, what does it mean to you?
Well, I think that the point of that is that how do you achieve the best out of what you've got? That would be my definition of high impact leadership, and I think that's very different in different scenarios. You know, at the end of the day, there's taking advantage of a great environment, and there's sort of a defensive position, and probably we're moving towards the latter rather than the former for a period. And so, in the context of the current environment, is sort of maximizing the potential in a difficult, volatile, and in some ways unpleasant sort of landscape. And within that context, I think that you see very strong operational skills needed, and you see leaders who are consistent. And there's probably more opportunity in a tighter and more difficult market than actually, ironically, in a good market, because leadership is more differentiated. So, and is more visible. But it is context, and I think in the context of the current environment, it's going to be getting productivity up. It's going to be driving people, motivating them, and being resilient, and probably coping on a personal level from the balance perspective, because I think it's going to be pretty intense.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the point around opportunities, again, it's much cited, isn't it? It's during recessionary periods the great sort of wave of next companies are born. I think you can see that from 2007, 2008. But I guess it's then having that quality in the leadership team to really identify the opportunities and have the appetite for risk to seize them. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think you will have businesses now that are in the wrong position at the wrong time, as there always is. And I think if you've got a highly leveraged business balance sheet at the moment, I think it's going to be a pretty difficult road through. And so there will be some basic economic pieces that play out, and even brilliant leadership with a broken balance sheet will struggle. I think what you can say, even in those scenarios, the best leaders will be able to find a way out, but they'll need to find it quickly. So that is a consolidation play, but consolidation fast would be my advice, because the landscape's not going to improve fast enough. So general consensus is this is a 2 to 3 year pattern rather than a 1 to 2 year pattern. And with the 2 to 3 year pattern, with interest rates going up and the access to capital tightening, you're kicking it down the line. I think it's going to be extremely dangerous. And I think that's going to be a really key thing around the dynamic discussions between the operational business and the board, to be really honest and open about that. And we're already seeing those conversations going on, and I think that's going to be really important. And I think then if you look at sort of businesses that have a good balance sheet, that's really different, because actually capital flows into them faster. You're more differentiated, but it's maintaining that. And it's ensuring that your productivity, your investor story, your stakeholder stories are consistent. It's the consistent piece and not reactive, which I think is going to make a massive difference. Leaders that I think are very reactive, I think will struggle. I think those that are consistent, that ensure that they have clarity of environment, I think will outperform.
What from the CEO's perspective, what is their sort of, I guess, what's the psychology of the CEO? What sort of mindset do they need in this kind of environment?
I think if you're the CEO at the moment and you haven't got a clean head, I get it very fast. So, that element of, if you're coming into this tired, I think it's going to be very hard to come out the other end in a positive scenario. And I think you are going to see more CEO change for obvious reasons, both CEOs recognizing that this is a 2 to 3 year time, and also boards recognizing that the CEO potentially isn't in the right place for that change. So I think that's the first thing. Look yourself in the mirror, ask yourself a question: are you here for 2 to 3 years? And if you're not, actually, it's pretty binary. I think if you are, you then got to say to yourself, have my ExCo, are we all aligned? Because actually that's the bit you can do fast, is get your ExCo in the right place. And so make sure you allocate time and resource to it. Then you've got to get your board aligned, and then you've got to get the business aligned. And that would be the order that I would see a CEO working through. Don't do the board bit first. You've got to get your ExCo in the right place, get your ExCo in the right place, and actually the board will line into that, because actually it's a consistent message coming from the business. And then you can drive it into the organization, and you got to do that fast. So the bit is now a lot of time with your ExCo, making sure you're triangulating discussions. Any areas of difference of opinion should be thrashed out and agreed to make sure the consistency is there.
I was going to ask a question around the CFO and then the HRD. I mean, the CFO is going to have a key role to play in this environment, so that relationship with the CEO has to be spot on, doesn't it?
I think that absolutely. I think that the CFO will be of higher importance. I think that hope you've got a strategic one who's able to really drive that agenda, as opposed to one to follow the agenda, because the danger of that is you're following a negative environment and they'll be overly pushing on cost controls, and you've got to get the balance right. So, but I think that finance will have more power. The board will want to see more regular input. I think finance directors is going to have pressure in terms of workload. You're going to have refinancing issues. You're going to have all of the volumes, and you're going to have rebudgeting. So there's pressure on that. And I think one of the things in observation is really important, that you support the CFO on that agenda, because they do work across the business. That time spent between CEO and CFO has to go up in this environment, because there's going to be more breaks in the chain. So you've got to make sure that you're really aligned. And that links to your stakeholder story, whatever your ownership structure, whether it's public sector, private equity, or listed in any format, you're going to have more stakeholder pressure and time. So right at the point when you're going to need to put more time into operational pieces, you're going to need to put more time into the board.
You're going to need to have real hard conversations around what's driving value in the business, and maybe if you need to divest, you divest and you move on that. And that's not necessarily easy when the financing landscape is tightening. But again, it's having those conversations, isn't it? And it's balancing the day-to-day with making those strategic decisions.
I think the point is you've got to have a clear strategy plan, and you've got to have a clear alignment on that strategy plan, and then you can execute it. And in some ways, the good thing is, in a difficult market, actually, you could argue that it's easier to get alignment on some of those things, because actually there's a needs must scenario. The execution against it, I think, is more difficult, especially when you play out on a global scale with multiple complexities. There is going to be a difficulty of selling businesses off. I mean, valuations haven't come down, but I think will come down significantly, because the access debt, that is not going on at the moment. So you look at transaction elements, they're coming off. And so the element of divesting business, I think that's when you look at smart, you look at partnering businesses up with others.
Again, in the mid-market, I mean, certainly in the UK, banks are pulling away from deals. You can see the debt funds are not necessarily keen to back them, and the funding that is available is a lot more expensive. So you can see that tightening up, and the IPO market has been effectively closed for a long time now. So, like you say, the M&A landscape is getting tougher. Deals are happening, but nowhere near like the feeding frenzy we've seen in the past couple of years.
Well, I think deals are happening. There's also deals falling over the last minute because they can't get the debt in place. So the deal is technically going to go through, subject to debt in place, and then the debt doesn't. And that's a deteriorating environment, because as there's every ratchet up of the interest rates goes on a global basis, that position gets more difficult. So, that is, we've been used to a really benign environment from a business landscape because we've had free access to capital, cheap capital. That part is over. And so we've got a different sort of environment. So growth is a more interesting thing. If you take the earlier stage businesses, very hard now to raise a business without it having a clear focus of when it'll be cash generative. That's a massive difference to where we've been over the last 7 years. Now, it's not to say that there aren't spaces where that will still exist, particularly around clean tech areas, because obviously that drive with energy still remains true. But straightforward business principles are becoming more important in an environment where sort of, whether it's government or individually, cash is going to become more important.
It's not to be overly negative, because there are opportunities, but again, it's just understanding and responding to that shift in the landscape, isn't it? And being brutally honest about the changes that have occurred. We mentioned the CFO there. Clearly hugely important. The HRD, how do you see the expectations around the HRD changing from a CEO's perspective?
I think there's going to be one word on everyone's lips, and that's productivity. So the people agenda is going to be huge within that. So I think you'll see it still being the number one issue for CEOs boards, but it will be around productivity much more than skills access. So there will be certain bits of skills access still there, but you'll see it much more about that productivity piece, the right workforce, the right environment, the right culture, that performance culture. So that language is going to shift the paradigm. I think you'll have a need for more operational HR, where they're driving, because ultimately business change and transformation. So there's going to be real pressure on that perspective. But that alignment between strategy, capital, and people, that's the triangle. So for every organization, they've got to get that triangle right. And the relationship around that triangle is going to be the core differentiator between success and the quality of the debate around it. And talent and that triangle is going to be really exposed.
Yeah, you'll need a leadership team, won't you? You won't want highly competent or brilliant individuals. Obviously, there's an element of that, but they will need to be working together as a team in this environment.
I think you're going to need followership in this environment more than ever. So there's a lot of focus on leadership, and yes, you're going to have leadership, but no, you're going to have belief and followership through that, which means real open, honest dialogue.
What do you mean by followership in the context we're discussing it exactly?
Followership is that element of belief in the mission and the purpose, and so that people believe in the leadership. So when leadership go right, they go right, as opposed to when leadership says go right, and everyone looks at it and starts drifting over there, and some drift to the left. And because at the end of the day, you'll be exposed to leaders. So the leader that sits in the general's turret issuing orders, you won't be successful. The leader who's visible, who's able to impart that message, and is really honest, about ambiguity, which I think leaders can really struggle with. Generally, leaders like being able to say, we're going right, we're going left. It's all great. Actually, this is an environment where you've got to be able to articulate an ambiguous landscape and the opportunity within that. And that's a more difficult, I think, nuance. But that's really important, because the big consistency, or the big message that comes out around the people agenda, is they want to see consistency from leadership. That honesty, being treated like an adult, is really important. So the business that it's all great guns and then suddenly it's not, there's got to be an honest conversation around those things. And that's really important, because people can take bad news, but not if they're surprised. and out of context. And I think that consistency and openness in leadership is really important.
Building on what we discussed there, I guess I'm interested to know that for a new CEO coming in, because we've mentioned that there will be changes, how can they know whether they really have a team if there is that agreement and consensus on the plan? What are the questions they should be asking?
I think generally a CEO, by the time they got to CEO, should within them know that they have or haven't got the team around them. I think they've got to be open with themselves around that. And I think that you can get swept along with activity. So you have an ExCo meeting and you know that things weren't quite right, but instead of circling around and having one-to-one conversations around it, you sort of ignore it because you get swept along and it's busy and I don't quite get to it. And I think in this environment, that's really, becomes fatal very fast. You lose the dressing room incredibly fast as a CEO. I think that there's a great comment from me from a CEO that we work with at Criticaleye, and his comment was that you have to be a counsellor in these environments because ultimately you've got to take on other people's pressure. And I think that's really insightful from the role of the CEO. I think that you have to have a knowledge of the individual's challenges that go beyond the sort of functional elements to the actual human elements of where they are. And I think good CEOs have that. And I think as such, they have a real instinct for when the team's slightly off kilter. And that's the pit you've got to watch for, that slightly off kilter piece. So that the EQ CEOs will have obviously a stronger position than those who are less strong in that area, because you won't see the pieces. And I think so that for me is really important. You spend more one-on-one time with your team and make sure that they're not always a structured agenda. I think CEOs can get very much into sort of structured agenda with their team, and I think open dialogue is going to be really important.
Why? Why is it more important now?
Because I think you remember that you're human beings, and that makes you more prepared to talk openly. And I think that the roles themselves sort of remove elements of human being because they become functional. And generally when things functional, that's when gaps appear. So I think the element of, also you've got to remember these are human beings and they've got, complex challenges. There's going to be a lot of anger flying around. If you've got a leadership team where the pressure is getting to them, that's going to drive straight into the organization. So you're not going to see that in a structured meeting. You will see that in a discussion about how things are home. You will get that from that wider conversation. I think it's vitally important that you have the ability to talk in an open format.
Okay. If you could reflect on the different senior execs that you've worked with, what would be some of the traits and characteristics then that are the hallmarks of leaders that really do make an impact?
I think let's take two separate scenarios because I think both of them are real. The first time younger executive who is suddenly the CEO, ExCo, but put into a position of authority, and it's the first time, and I think that those seek out experience. Those are the ones who come to Criticaleye or mentoring access, are really open about things and suck out of other people experiences that give them reference points because they know they haven't got it. So they don't have the arrogance to say I've got all the answers. They recognize they haven't, and they put the structure around themselves. I think the other converse side is this sort of older, experienced executive. If I'm honest, those that retain curiosity. These environments require you to have the ability to evolve and change.
Yeah.
And I think that for some of the more experienced executive, and again, that access to different insights, an actual ability to challenge yourself for your knowns as a more experienced CEO is really important. I had a meeting with the FTSE 100 CEO who was talking about his own refreshment. I'm talking about Criticaleye supporting them around refreshment because actually it's a successful CEO, been in tenure for a while, but recognises that actually there's a point where he needs refreshment. I think that's incredibly insightful. And I think that, again, you've got in some ways this market where you've got a lot of both of these scenarios, a lot of step up. As you know, Marc, we're doing a massive amount of work in organizations on step up with this pressure, young executives coming through. And then you've got experience, because experience going to count. But that experience to make sure that they're still curious in a world that is totally changing so fast, you can't use last year's playbook or 10-year-old playbook on the next 2 years. It's a new playbook, and you've got to work your own playbook out, but you've got to make sure that you're refreshed and you've got that reference point, because society is very different.
No, I think that's. I mean, it's the refrain, isn't it? The sort of the multiple headwinds that you're facing. It's okay, like you say, the financing landscape is changing. There's where do you stand on the climate change agenda? The customers shifting. You've got the workforce challenges. So it's essential. It's got to be in your DNA, hasn't it, to have that adaptability and curiosity. Okay, you mentioned the board earlier, so I'd like to come on to that, because from what we've talked through here, you can see that, I mean, one of the things that's clearly happening is the operational footprint of businesses is changing. Do you think that's causing pressure in boardrooms? Because you can get a lag, can't you, between what's happening operationally and then how the board is understanding and connecting in some ways with that. Just wondered what your thoughts are on this.
Well, as you know, we do a lot of work in both sides of this equation, and my observation is that the boardroom piece is probably coming towards the hardest point I've seen in my 20 years of running Criticaleye. I think that for a number of different reasons, the pace is so fast, the analytics lag, and the governance and the pressure on that board, I think, is huge. So I think a number of things are going to come through. I think there is going to be much more difference of opinion. That becomes difficult. I think there will be more challenges between operations and the board. I think because of stakeholder pressure, that drives into the board. So I don't think there will be many nice, easy boards. So there'll be also massive time pressures. So that's in itself will create difficulty. And I mean, you're already seeing it. I mean, we've got a number of chairs coming to us looking to uplift the competencies in their board, which again, usually they would be an expectation of someone's got there, so they're obviously competent. And I think now that piece is really, really important, because if you have a board that isn't functioning at a high level at a point when there's such ambiguity, I think it's incredibly dangerous, because they also can create work for the operational business. So they're going to really have to know what capacity the executive have to provide that insight. And again, it's going to be alignment. Chair, CEO, CFO alignment is going to be absolutely critical. I mean, we talk about the board. It's going to expose the competency of the chair, but the chair's ability to be really honest about the competencies in that boardroom, I think, is going to really be key.
I'll come on to chair CEO, but it's interesting because we had a chair ready session. So part of our chair ready program, we had a discussion last week, and it was looking at driving the strategic board agenda. And one of the points made was that as a chair, are your NEDs contributing? How are they contributing? It was interesting, actually. A lot of the focus was on, you want industry expertise. You do need also a counterpoint, a different point of view, but you absolutely have to have NEDs who are asking questions, who understand what's being discussed and aren't just passengers. And that absolutely falls on the responsibility of the chair, but then also to support them as well, because things are changing so quickly. Like the business that you may have joined could be changing fundamentally. So I guess to your point, it's also an element of support as well to those non-executive directors. Well,
I think one of the things, it's going to be very hard for people to pay more in this environment. Just, the optics on that are going to be pretty tough. you can give them the skills. And I think that's vitally important. So, a chair who's got a board where there are gaps, they can't just take individuals out and pay a bit more and get another one in. I think they've got to uplift people. And I think that's where good chairs will find budget. And I think that's where, again, this sort of element of really being honest about things is going to be really important, because there is going to be tension. And the danger of that tension is that if you haven't got the competency to deal with it, then it spirals and it spikes into different places. And I think that's going to be the really interesting thing. And you will have much more direct conversations, and actually that will become uncomfortable. I'm hearing a lot of comments around anger at the moment. We come out of 2 years of COVID, that's generally in society. That's going to be thrown at people. And that issue is going to be really important for the boardroom to really understand the footprint, but also understand the pressures that are around them and how they release that pressure and how they input. And I think non-executives who really aren't committed to the organisations they're on or on it just taking a wage, I think they should leave now.
But if you talk about some of these, if you like, toxic elements, so investor pressure, it's going to come from there. If you will increasingly see, obviously, pressure from investors. Where do you see the other pressure points coming from on boards? What's going to cause some of this potential toxicity?
I think you've got pressure in all regard. I mean, your workforce will be difficult. You see on a global basis the challenges that they have, and as there is real inflation in there. That real inflation puts real pressure on everyone. So I think that there's an old expression I've seen along the way in Criticaleye, is that you work at those points when you work twice as hard for half as much. That's where we're going to be over the next 2 years. That's all right. To a certain extent, get your head around that, because you're going to have to work harder. And by the way, you're going to earn less. And that's important for leaders to understand, because that's going to be the mantra that they're going to have to drive into their organizations. So the pressure is going to come all around. It's how they thrive in it. At the end of the day, this is situational. And if you adjust, it's incredibly stimulating and differentiating. And so that's the biggest of it. The opportunity to create something different. It will be about being really aligned to the purpose, because that element of people that go back to the sort of alignment piece, where there is that clear purpose, makes massive difference.
We're talking about high impact leadership, but within that, you obviously have to look at the board. What does a high impact board look like at the moment? How do boards really make a difference? What does their approach need to be in this environment?
Well, I think that over the years of Criticaleye, I think that there's quite straightforward, connected to the business and connected to what it's doing beyond sort of reports. I think that the differential between, you take it as read that by the time you get onto a board that you're competent around sort of the structural elements of being on a board. So so understanding them is different. The nuances is in the complexity and the relationship pieces. And again, understanding outside of the special bit that you probably have a knowledge of. So for me, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. A non-executive who is actually passionate about the organization and the environment that business is in, that has their own interest in it, I mean, that's massive. I would say probably that's true of about 40% of non-executives, would be my gut feel. I think there's probably 60% that to a certain extent would articulate their passion about it, but probably a bit grey. And that's the 60%. I think it's very punchy, but it's the amount of time they allocate. And I mean, I think that still quite a lot of boards that see that the role is the time allocated into the formal bits. Actually, much like any leadership role, it's the hours you put in outside that's the real definition. The evening that you turn up somewhere, the information that you read about that's not been given to you, that you find out from your own perspective. It's the back knowledge, the back skilling yourself that's critical, because those are the things that when you then get to these complex conversations, you've got different reference points, you've got different confidence, you're able to have a more informed conversation. And that's what executives are looking for. That's what a chairman's looking for. So for me, the high performing, the high impact NED is curious, has different access points, continually invests in skilling themselves outside their competency areas. And they're the ones who have ability to have better quality debate.
And that's the question chairs need to be asking when they're looking at the composition of their boards, and I guess when looking at themselves as well.
My general view is there's not enough challenge on them. There's not enough rotation on NEDs. I think if you're honest and you went into a chair and you said of your board are all the NEDs fully contributing in a normal environment, they probably wouldn't answer. They'd all say yes. I think in this environment they're probably more honest. I think that honesty is really important, and I think then what are you doing about it? And if you had a CEO and they had a member of their ExCo that wasn't performing, you'd be dealing with it. And I think that's where chairmen have got to be more involved. I think it's vitally important that you don't have a weak link on a board.
Okay, so how are you supporting the executive team? How are you contributing? And I guess why are you really there?
Yeah,
because the execs the CEO and CFO will spot it.
And the point of it, that the good executives want challenge, good quality challenge. Really understanding the complexity and being able to, because a great CEO, a high impact CEO, wants to come into the board that they respect and feel that they're being scrutinized, but in a positive way. And that's the reality. In the same way that the executive landscape is going to be tougher and tighter, that boardroom dynamic should have tougher, better quality around it. And again, you're not going to be able to pay them more, but you can upskill them and give them the reference points. And I think that will be essential.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add or cover regarding high impact leadership, Matthew?
I think that the real risk for CEOs with their leadership team is a burnout and sort of the pressure that will come of the intensity of the environment. And I think that, I was with a CEO the other day who was talking about the anger of their consumers. I think you are going to see real anger coming from different places. And again, that making sure that you give them the right support structures to cope through that and the right reference point, because the danger is that often you can't see those challenges coming to the surface. And by the time they come to the surface, it's too late. So they do need context. They do need to have the ability to reference outside. The mentoring becomes massively important, because being able to download and put context into things is vitally important. And pushing your team to make sure that they retain those things, vitally important.
Perspective, isn't it? It's making sure that you've got those multiple viewpoints and that discipline to step back and look at what's going on around you. Okay. Thank you, Matthew. I'll end our first podcast here on high impact leadership. In our next episode, which will be released in mid-October, we'll be speaking to Sally Bridgeland, Chair of Impact Asset Management, and getting her views on what high impact leadership looks like. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation and look forward to speaking to you again. Take care.
Thanks, Mark.